Continuing our romp through all of these Beastmen lords, I want to talk about a lord that I think the Beastmen have forgotten, and that is Gore Thor. That's a pretty Beastman name. But we're going to talk about a lord that is, for the longest time, he was just kind of the generic, stock, special character, legendary lord for the Beastmen. I think when Khazrak One-Eye came out, he kind of fell to the wayside because Khazrak had a little bit more of an intriguing story, and it intersected a little bit with prominent members of the Empire. So I think Gore Thor kind of fell out of favor, but I think he is still a really awesome and really cool character. And what we're going to do today is not just talk about the 7th edition version of Gore Thor, because I think that's actually where he starts to get watered down and more or less forgotten. We're going to talk more about his 6th edition iteration, which actually has a lot of flavor and a lot more fluff to it. Even the little lore segment for Gore Thor is much larger in 6th than it is in 7th. And this is mainly because of the portrayal, or at least the streamlining of 7th and 8th edition over 6th edition rules. 6th edition rules were a little bit more ham-fisted. They were a lot more complex in the sense that there was just more very specific minute rules per legendary lord, that in 7th and 8th edition Games Workshop said, hey, let's just kind of streamline this and give them generic traits that anyone can understand. For example, Gore Thor has the ability on his magic weapon to do Killing Blow in 7th edition. In 6th edition, that weapon has a much different damage profile that has to do with doubles and triples and quadruples rolled. So it becomes something that's a little more cumbersome to explain. So I understand why they did that, moving from 6th to 7th. But I think that from a Total War Warhammer perspective, 6th edition Gore Thor makes a lot more sense. And I'll explain why when we get to his magic items and his special rules. Let's start out, though, with his massive little lore portion. And massive and little are two opposing words, so that's an oxymoron. But the lore portion for Gore Thor, the Beastlord. Gore Thor the Cruel was the greatest Beastlord ever to have lived. Over 1,000 years ago, during the time of the Crusades, his warband ravaged the forests of the Empire, and all but destroyed the provinces of Ostland and Hochland. Its name can still be found on some of the most ancient herdstones. There have been many Beastlords who have united tribes into mighty war herds, but Gore Thor was unique among his kind, for he possessed one thing that all others have lacked, yet vision. Gore Thor was convinced that the gods had selected him as their emissary, that he was destined to control the forests in their name. Though he had no true magical powers, he had something of the shaman about him, often falling into seizures or visited by nightmarish visions of the future. Such was his fervor in battle, he would sometimes be surrounded by coronas of dark energy, which would protect him or strike out at his foes, a sure sign to other beastmen the gods truly favored him. With great strength of arm and cunning, he fought his way through the ranks of Gores to become a chieftain, but his sheer intensity never left him, growing in strength to match his ever-increasing power. Before long, he had united all the tribes of the Middle Mountains under his banner, and most chieftains would have been satisfied with far less, but not Gore Thor. His purpose was to destroy the entire world in the name of chaos. He gathered forces and magical artifacts, the like of which no beastman had ever seen. He slew the orc warlord Gugrud Gutripper, and took the Greenskins' magic spear, Impaler. He challenged and killed Karanarsh, Doombowl, claiming the skull of Mulgrar from the Minotaur's shrine. Ogres, trolls, giants, and even mighty dragon ogres all flocked to join his war herd, drawn by some unknown instinct to the gathering power of chaos in the heart of the mountains. When Gore Thor unleashed hell upon the old world, the Empire was totally unprepared. Many knights and warriors were absent, fighting in the Crusades in Araby and Astalia, and as Gore Thor's war herd surged out of the mountains, town after town was razed to the ground by the unstoppable horde. Other than simply raiding the towns, Gore Thor's purpose was total destruction, and his warband slaughtered every man, woman, and child they found, save one from each town who would be spared to spread panic amongst neighboring settlements. Leaving Ostland devastated in his wake, Gore Thor continued on his rampage into the smaller province of Hochland. It was well for the Empire that the state was ruled by Count Mikhail, a man as ruthless as he was brave, unpopular with his people, but prepared to do anything to stop the Beastlord. Public outrage, the Count spent the time he had before Gore Thor's arrival strengthening the defenses of Hergig, Hochland's capital. Rather than riding the aid of the towns in the path of Gorthor's advance. By the time Gorthor's army reached the city, the defenses were in place. A maze of walls, trenches, and stakes stood between the Horde and Hergig's gates. It took the Beastmen 3 weeks of bloody slaughter to break through the Count's ingenious defenses, the defenders raining arrows, boiling water, burning oil, rocks, and flaming torches down on them at every step. Frustrated by the resistance of the men and their leader, Gorthor promised his warriors all of the spoils, asking nothing for himself but the head count. The Beastmen doubled their efforts, and on the 22nd day of the siege of the gates of Hergig, finally splintered under the Beastmen's rams. But still the men fought on. Count Mikhael forbade his archers from carrying quivers, ordering them to drive their arrows into the ground. They would not give an inch to the Beastmen. He equipped the most able men with all the available weapons and armor, sending the old and infirm to the front lines to delay and tire the enemy. He had the wives and children of his soldiers carry food and water to the front lines, ensuring that no thought of retreat entered the men's minds. But the hordes of Gorthor were innumerable, and the defenders were cut down in droves. The Count's castle had been under siege for weeks when the battle finally turned. Freshly back from the Crusades, the recently founded Knights of the Blazing Sun, having heard that Hergig was under attack, had ridden straight for the city and plowed into the rear of the Chaos Army, their lances and swords cutting a bloody path through the unprepared Beastmen. Count Mikhael seized his chance. Leading his personal bodyguard, he burst forth from the castle and carved into the scattered war herd. Gorthor realized he had to take action or all would be lost. Chanting wildly, magical energy lashing out in all directions, he hacked his way through the melee till he stood before Count Mikhael, and with a roar engaged him in single combat. But Mikhael possessed a magical amulet which protected him from Gorthor's halo of dark power, and the generals fought for nearly 2 hours, their magical weapons drawing blood at every stroke. Finally, the killing blow was struck. The Count's runefang overcame the magic of Impaler, smashing the spear in two, and dealt the Beastlord a mortal blow. With the death of their general, the Horde fled to the forests, with the Knights of the Blazing Sun in pursuit, though Count Mikhael died of his horrific injuries barely minutes after his victory. Gorthor's war herd had left a permanent scar on the north of the Empire. Hawkland and Ostland were not fully rebuilt for decades, and though 1,000 years have passed since his death, his name is still used to curse enemies and frighten wayward children. Even in times of peace, the forests are regarded by the people with great fear and superstition. And amongst Beastmen, his memory remains. It is said that one day, another Beastlord with might and vision of Gorthor will emerge, and once more the thrones of the world will tremble before the children of chaos. The lore for Gorthor is pretty large and sweeping. It kind of falls in line with Gorbad Ironclaw from the Greenskins, right? This generic lord, for the most part, that commands a great army that does a massive sweeping attack into the Empire. Gorbad's Wa is one of the biggest Was to have ever, reached the Old World, and the same thing with Gorthor's massive war herd, attracting doom bulls, ogres, trolls, giants, dragon ogres, everything. So Gorthor the Beastlord, I think, on paper, Games Workshop probably even knew this. Hey, this is a generic Beastlord. How do we make this guy cool? Well, we'll add on all this spice about his lore. But I still think that from a Total War Warhammer perspective, I think Gorthor could be a pretty awesome legendary lord. Now, before we jump into the special rules, his mechanics, and magic items, I want to talk about the possibility of Gorthor coming into Total War Warhammer. I mean, this is the point of this video, right? It's speculation. What I think would make him interesting, or at least different from the other legendary lords for the Beastmen, is to make him the very first true hybrid lord, in that he can bring dragon ogres into the faction, or a larger variety of trolls into the faction, because that's part of his lore, right? That he attracts all these things. And this is, I know that my personal opinion here is that Tarox will probably be the one that they would choose for a DLC for the Beastmen, because he's just so badass and he's so different from the other lords. But I think Gorthor is another chance that we could get Doom Bulls added to the roster, because he would bring them as part of his, oh, come to me, I'm Gorthor the Mighty, because I have a generic Beastman. But on top of it, he could bring stuff like Tuskors to the table, which is something that we haven't seen in Total War Warhammer yet. We've seen the Razor Gore chariot, but the Tusk Gore is like the little brother to the Razor Gore. The Razor Gore had 5 strength and 5 toughness, versus the Tusk Gore chariot had 4 strength and 5 toughness, or I believe it's 5 strength and 4 toughness. It's one or the other. But still, it's not as imposing of a chariot, but I think that the difference could be between a Tusk Gore chariot and a Razor Gore chariot is that the Tusk Gore chariot could be the anti-large variant. In the rules, actually, the Razor Gore chariot was the better chariot. It had more defense, and it added fear and thunderous charge to the rules. That's clearly not a thing in Total War Warhammer. So I think that the Tusk Gore chariot being an anti-large chariot would be really awesome, right? We get that with the Dark Elves. We get an large and an anti-infantry chariot. Well, we get a chariot that can shoot anti-large missiles. But focusing on Gore Thor's ability, it plays very well into Tusk Gore. Well, we'll talk about that in a second as we get to his magic items. Let's talk about his rules. So he's got the Mark of Chaos here, and that obviously is going to give him any kind of perks that it would as normal here. But his special rules are kind of the big different thing between 6th and 7th edition. In 6th edition, he has Bagrar the Tamer. This guy basically is his charioteer that leads his special Tusk Gore chariot. And we've seen this, right, with most recently with Grom the Paunch in Niblet, and we get this little cool characteristic goblin that's actually a henchman for the main character. So it'd be pretty cool to kind of just see that again with Beastmen. Maybe it's a trope that's already been done, but Bagrar doesn't, he kind of just falls off after 6th edition. We don't ever hear about him in any kind of big expanse outside of just that 6th edition entry here. And he also gets an ability called Beloved of the Gods. In 7th edition, this is called Scion of the Gods, or Scion of the Dark Gods. And the way the game essentially tells you is that every magic phase, you roll a dice and you generate a spell from the lore of death. Well, the way I envision this, and the way I think it'd be really cool, is if rather than you generate a random spell at the beginning of every match or something like that, what if it was, again, very similar to Luthor Harkon, in that every couple of turns you would fall into this fit or this seizure, and you would have a vision, and through that vision you would be granted a quest. You go do the quest, and then maybe be granted a spell from the lore of death. That way you kind of have this set target for your campaign. Or every couple of turns you fall into this fit or vision, you're granted a random lore of death spell and also some other campaign abilities. Like, okay, you have nightmarish visions of all these terrifying things that frighten the world of man. Okay, well now you get Aspect of the Dread Knight spell, and you get all men that attack you, all Empire, Bretonia, anything like that, gets -10 to leadership, something of the sort. So some sort of campaign mechanic that falls in line with the narrative of the actual fluff of the seizure, and a corresponding spell. That's how I think that could be done in a pretty easy way that we've seen already with Luthor Harkon, and done to really solid execution. As far as magic items though, Gorthor has 3 big ones, and they're pretty cool here. So the first one is Impaler. Impaler is a monstrous spear with brutal barbs placed on iron rings along its entire length. When pulled free, it rends flesh and gouges bone, mangling its victims beyond recognition. So I look at this as kind of the typical, oh, this is going to be my heavy damage item. I'm going to pop it. It's going to increase my base weapon damage and my AP. I think that's a pretty easy little formula here that we've seen for a lot of abilities. But I think also it could give a bonus to anti-large, and inherently he has anti-large as part of his kit. So that maybe he does, like, just say 25 anti-large. I'm just throwing a blanket number out there. And Impaler increases anti-large by 20%, maybe even an aura around him to help him bring down large creatures. And if he's riding with other Tusk Gores, it makes it a pretty cool thematic Tusk Gore chariot thing. And this is what I want to see, is that Tusk Gore chariots do AP anti-large damage, because they had Bestigors that were on them with great weapons and Gores with spears. So there was no range damage coming out of them, but I still think that this plays very well into the possibility of bringing Tusk Gores into the roster. And I don't really think that Tusk Gores are the thing that everyone wants in the Beastmen roster. I know we all want Gorgons and we all want Jabberslythes, But I just still think this is a cool way to bring them in, because you can also have those large creatures, Gorgons and Jabberslights, because again, this guy attracts everything as he is the scion of the dark gods. He attracts all these different portions of the Beastmen roster. And you have to remember, at one point, the Beastmen, the Warriors of Chaos, and the Demons of Chaos were all in one book. It wasn't until 6th edition that they all splintered off into Demons of Chaos, Beasts of Chaos, and Hordes of Chaos. And then in the subsequent editions after that, they became the Beastmen, Demons of Chaos, and Chaos. So it kind of really evolved from that 5th edition book or 4th edition book that was all everything in one, to these splintered factions that could actually ally and borrow from one another. This kind of further supports that notion that Gore Thor could be a really cool hybrid lord, taking some of the large beasts from Chaos and adding them into the Beastmen roster. Well, the ones that don't already exist. We also get Skull of Mugrar. This is the skull of the legendary lord of Minotaurs, Mugrar, and it is fastened to Gore Thor's chariot. It is enchanted with a powerful spell that curses those who would attack its carrier. And these two, both the Impaler and the Skull of Mugrar, had these really cool, complex 6th edition rules. The Impaler's like, in addition, if any of Gore Thor's to hit rolls are doubles, triples, or quadruples, each of those attacks will wound automatically. So again, super complex, very niche. Skull of Mugrar. His hits against Gore Thor or his chariot with a strength of greater than 5 count as strength 5 instead. So again, a super, not complex rule, but it needs explaining. So I think the Skull of Mugrar could be something that it gives a negative, or I'm sorry, gives a penalty to anything in an aura around him, like that 30-40 meter radius, that reduces melee attack. So that the Skull of Mugrar kind of gets that, okay, it's cursing those who would attack its carrier, it's reducing their likelihood to hit him, and maybe even a weapon strength debuff as well. We don't really see that too often. We see abilities that reduce melee attack, or we see things that reduce melee attack from other skills, but we very rarely see it attached to weapon strength as far as a general 40 meter radius type of ability, an aura type of ability. But I'd like if the Skull of Mugrar did that, like -7 to melee attack and -10% to weapon strength. Maybe that's a little too much. I'm throwing some blanket numbers out there, but it'd be cool to see that mechanic brought about. And the reason I don't think it should be ward save is because of the next item, Cloak of the Beastlord. Alone amongst beastmen, Gore Thor does not fear the curse on slaying a shaman, for he knows that his favor amongst the gods is greater even than theirs. He made the Cloak of the Beastlord from the hides of those shamans he killed. Again, this one has a super complex rule. For example, a strength 3 hit would grant a 3-up ward save. 5 would grant 5-up ward save. So, again, 6th edition complex rules. I think this one needs to be pretty cut and dry. Give it a ward save, give it a magic resistance because it's the pelt of Beastmen Shamans. I think that's a really cool kind of thematic addition here. And also give it a Winds of Magic reserve or regeneration bonus innately. And this is mainly because he himself is going to generate random magical spells, right? And this thing has magic imbued into it through the fluff. So I think that that's a really cool way to do it, right? Give it some magic resistance, give it like a 5 or 10% ward save, and also have it give some Winds of Magic reserve or Winds of Magic regeneration bonus. Very quick, very easy. And on top of it, I mean, when we take a look at some of the lore behind this character, right? When it talks about how he raises cities, here it is right here. Save one from each town who would be spared to spread panic amongst neighboring settlements. It'd be cool if that was a campaign ability for Gore Thor, that he would reduce the leadership of any foreign army when he's in their territory or they're in his, because of that spreading of fear. That's an ability that he could have as part of just a generic, okay, it's his top line campaign, unique traits for Gore Thor. I think Gore Thor is, again, a generic Beastlord, and that's not too cool. But I think that when you really looked at his magic items and his abilities and his lore, he can make for probably one of the coolest Beastmen lords. I mean, outside of a raging Minotaur, of course, because he just brings so many cool, different, dynamic things to the table. He has this really cool lore about him. He has these awesome items about him, and I think that he just has a special flavor that the other lords don't really have in the way that Gore Thor does. And I think, again, Games Workshop does this on these generic, boring lords. Like, Erloth is a pretty boring lord when you really take a look at it. But if you think about in the grand scale, or grand scheme, of Wood Elf Legendary Lords, he's one of the only ones who's just a plain old Wood Elf. So I think that Gore Thor is probably not likely to be the next Legendary Lord for the Beastmen. But I think that he has all the makings for a great DLC or even FLC character in Total War Warhammer 2. But I want to thank you guys so much for watching here today. Let me know in the comment section below what you think of Gore Thor. Were you even aware that he had this level of complexity, or just simply being a Beastlord? And you really have to dive into that 6th edition rulebook to really get that. The 7th edition rules for him is just pretty much the bottom part of page 54. But the 6th edition stretches from page 70 with his sweeping lore, and then 71 is like almost entirely all of his rules with a little bit of lore on it. So he definitely switches from 6th edition to a prominent character with all these amazing abilities to 7th edition as a watered down character who just is kind of second fiddle to Khazrak in my opinion. But go ahead and let me know in the comment section below what you think about Gore Thor and his place in Total War Warhammer 2. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment below. And if you do subscribe, please go ahead and hit that little bell icon, turn on all notifications. This way you can find out about my upcoming modded Total War Warhammer 2 stream that I'm going to be doing, any other game giveaways, any guides that I do, or any kind of news or speculation that I cover next coming weeks, years, whatever it's going to be. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.